Minningar, snjór sem ég þjappa í greip, snóða í kúlu að kasta. Það hendur aðeins í huga mér, hér festir ekki snjó. Memories, snow which I press in my hands, knead into a ball and throw. But only in my mind. Snow does not settle here. Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Gerður Kristný's poem Blóðhófnir, translated into English by Rory McTurk into Bloodhoof. Gerður Kristný is a pretty prolific and popular poet and novelist in Iceland. Blóðhófnir actually won the prestigious Icelandic Literary Prize in 2010, but only a few of her poems have been translated into English. Fortunately, I can read a bit of Icelandic, and this edition from Arc Publications has both the English and the Icelandic published side by side, so it's actually quite easy to follow along in the original. I want to talk about this poem today for two reasons. One, I think that Gerður Kristný is in particular, and Icelandic authors in general, are often quite good, and they don't get enough attention because they write in a language that, less than 350,000 people speak. I love modern Icelandic literature, and this poem is a really nice gateway into Icelandic poetry. Which leads me to my second reason for why I want to talk about this book, which is because it effectively deals with an issue that is near and dear to my heart, which is the retelling of Norse mythology. As someone who studies Old Norse-Icelandic literature, I'm always eager to read modern adaptations, revisions, retellings of these stories, because that's exactly what I think myths are for, to be told and retold and changed and adapted. So what I want to do in this video is talk a bit about the Old Norse-Eddic poem that this modern poem is based on, before talking about Gerður's retelling and the ramifications of her adaptation. Blóðhófnir is based on a story told in an Eddic poem, either called För Skírnis, the journey of Skirnir, or Skírnismál, or the words of Skirnir. The reason for these titles is simply because this poem is preserved in two different medieval manuscripts, each of which gives it a different name. The first manuscript is the 13th century very famous Codex Regius, or Konungsbók, where it's called För Skírnis. And this manuscript is really important. I want to talk about it a little bit here, because this is where we get almost all Norse mythology, more or less. This is where we get almost all the Eddic poems like Völuspá and Havamal and Þormskvíða, among others. The second manuscript that preserves this poem is, I think, AM 7481 Quarto. And in that manuscript, it's called Skírnismál. For the sake of convenience, I'm going to refer to the poem as Skírnismál, because that's kind of what most academics refer to it as, though the edition that I'm using is actually from the Codex Regius manuscript, but this is not that important. This poem, the story that this poem tells is actually really important for Norse mythology. Snorri Sturluson retells it in his prose Edda, and he actually expands upon it quite a bit. But what's important here, and the reason why I'm going through all these different renditions here, is because this poem can certainly be dated to before the 13th century, where these manuscripts come from. And perhaps this could even be dated to before the year 1000. Most Eddic poetry is much older than the manuscripts in which they're preserved. But even in the Codex Regius, which is our oldest manuscript to witness, this poem is preluded by a prose section that sets up this poem for us in a very specific way, and sets up the speakers. And this prose section certainly dates from the 13th century. We actually know this because some of the words that it uses are 13th century. I think it calls Skírnir Skosveins Freys, Freyer's shoe boy, which almost certainly comes from the 13th century, probably by way of Old French and the Old French romances that were coming into Iceland. It's definitely not a 10th century word. But this is all to say that this story that comes to be called Skírnismál is already being partially adapted or added to or analyzed or interpreted in different ways throughout the Middle Ages. There's really no such thing as a pure or original myth when it comes to Norse mythology. They're always being changed and adapted. Let me just... Skírnismál tells the story of Freyr, one of the Vanir, who spots a May Fagra, a fair maid from Jotunheimr, giant land, and falls in love with her from afar. The prose text at the beginning explains Þar að fekk hann hugsotir miklar. From that he had great sickness of heart. To remedy this sadness that Freyr feels, he sends his servant, Skírnir, to retrieve this giantess that he saw, Gerður, so Freyr can marry her. Upon offering this proposition to Gerður, Skírnir is met with unwillingness and resistance, which really angers Skírnir, as he wants to be a good servant. And in stanza after stanza, he curses out Gerður in a whole bunch of different ways. Here's just a taste from stanzas 25 and 26. So this is Skírnir speaking. Sér þú þennan mæki mer mjóvan mjálvan ek hefi í hendi hér? Fyrr þessum eggjum snígur sá í álni Jotun, verðið þinn fegri faðir. Tansvendi ek þitt drepp, en ek þitt temjamun, mær, at minum monum, þar skaltu ganga, þitt gumna sinnir, þísan æva sé. And this is a pretty rough, just kind of word by word, literal translation of this. Do you see this sword, girl? Slender, inlaid, which I have here in my hand. Before these edges will fall the old Jotun, or giant. Your father will die, essentially. With a taming stick or a taming wand, I strike you, and I will tame you, girl, to my desire. There you will go where the sons of men will never see you again. So it's pretty harsh, and with threats like this, Gerður, the giantess, eventually gives in and agrees to go. But the poem ends actually without a really clear resolution. She essentially agrees, but tells them that they need to wait 9 days to retrieve her, and the poem ends with Freyr just kind of whinging about having to wait nine more days. There's a lot of interesting stuff to be said about these specific curses and threats that Skírnir makes, but I don't want to spend too much time on the Old Norse poem here. If you're interested in the Old Norse poem, I'm sure Dr. Jackson Crawford here on YouTube has a good video or two on it. So this Old Norse poem has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. And perhaps unsurprisingly, people focused and still kind of tend to focus on the lovesickness that Freyr experiences. That is, this poem is often read as a wooing poem or a poem about love, specifically love from afar. As far as I can tell, it really wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s where scholars like Caroline Larrington started writing articles from a feminist point of view, critiquing this poem and reading this poem through a feminist lens, that started to consider Gerður's perspective on this whole proposal. If we look at this story from her perspective, this story reads more like an abduction than a marriage proposal. And this is where Gerður Kristný takes up this story about her namesake. Right? They're both named Gerður. And she retells this myth from Gerður's perspective. Gerður Kristný uses a lot of the same poetic devices that Skírnismál uses, such as internal rhymes and alliterations, things that Old Norse poems use a lot. Though she doesn't really follow this strictly. This poem, Blóðhófnir, is much more free-flowing than the rather strict ljóðháttr meter that Skírnismál is written in. Another thing that it takes from the Old Norse is the sparseness of the language. It's laconic and often understated, and full of empty spaces. You can see that even the pages are primarily empty. With all this in mind, though, the poetic language is so powerful because of its simplicity. Here is the moment where Gerður initially refuses the proposal. I'll do the Icelandic in full first, followed by the English, just so you can kind of get a sense of the flow of both languages. And further, I'll just use Rory McTurk's translation, as he's a good scholar and I trust it. I actually think I have a book that's edited by Rory McTurk right here. A good introduction to Old Norse-Icelandic literature and culture. I think it's from 2004. And lastly, bear with my Icelandic pronunciation. It's probably not perfect. If you want to hear a really beautiful rendition of this poem into a sort of opera, there's a composer-producer named Kristín Þóra Haraldsdóttir, who produced a stage version of this called Blóðhófnir. I'll post a link in the video description. It's uploaded here on YouTube, and it's really wonderful. It sounds amazing. But anyways, here's the moment where Gerður refuses the proposal and Skírnir's reaction. Nei, ég kaus að vera kurt, þar sem ég þekkti hverja deild og drag, arna runu æða mér. Skírnir setti fram sögu af lógublíðu landi með laufgufðum skogi. Gullefli á grænum, mætti bjóða mér bíta? Nei, hann stæði fastur í hálsi mér. Þá bauð Skírnir hring, en mig skorti ekki startið. Næja boja fékk ég frá föður mínum. Þýturleik þokusókið kjar, róðin varð að rædu hvæsi, glerið í augnum brast. Ástin komin með alvapni, drengurinn dró fram svörð í hatri, skeftið skorið grímd. Svörðið song höfði mér vissu stelpu sem stipað við og deyr. Hálsinn skertur skurði. And now in English, no, I would stay. I chose to remain in the place where I knew every cranny and creek, and the rivers ran through my every vein. Skírnir spun a tale of a land of sweet calm, with a leafy branched forest bearing apples of gold. Would I care for a bite? No, it would only stick fast in my throat. What Skírnir then offered to me was a ring, but of rings for my fingers, of finery too. I had had gifts in full from my father. A howl then resounded through the mist-hung thicket. The voice grew into an angry hiss, and there came a crack in the glass of those eyes. Love had indeed come, armed to the teeth, with an envoy brandishing a hate-infused sword, its haft carved in cruelty. Over my head the sword sang a song, the song of a maiden who struggles and dies, her neck decked with a slash. What this poem does so well, I think, in so few words makes so apparent the social and political forces that are forcing Gerður to submit to Skírnir. The violence that Skírnir threatens her with is so explicit. This sword, by the way, that he's threatening her with, is Freyr's sword. Skírnir in the Old Norse poem goes to Freyr and asks for his sword before he goes on the expedition for Freyr. And what's interesting is that he never gives this sword back to Freyr. And for those of you who are familiar with Ragnarok, the kind of apocalyptic end times of Norse mythology, you'll know that Freyr really misses this sword when he goes up weaponless against Surtur. Eventually, she does give in after all of these threats, and she simply says, Skelfingin skorthafist I kvithi minum, thandist ut og þindist, bjarg sem bræði sér. Ég lofa því að koma, dauðan, leit ég svip mín í sverði drengsins. Terror took hold in my innermost parts, spreading out, weighing heavy, a boulder breaking its bounds. I said yes, I would come, and I saw my face, dead, reflected in the envoy's sword. It's pretty brutal, and unlike the Old Norse poem, where the ending just sort of leaves everything unresolved, here we get to see Freyr and Gerður together, and it's not good. Here are just two more short extracts about their interactions together. Han vaffi hári mínum hund sér og leiddi mig burt. Bærin reisti ranum, þakkið sögum. Inn við þér klædir itsku. He wrapped my hair around his hand and led me away to his residence, wrought of wretchedness, roofed with reticence, its timbers spliced with spite. And then just one more passage. Hramur freys hremdu mig, fleig þú mér innst í ótan, hann rísti sár í svörð, nýtt á hverri nóttu. Freyr's paws pawed me, reducing me to terror, scored a new scar on my skin each night. Freyr's wolfishness is really important throughout this whole poem, and it makes the whole interaction really feel more like a hunt than a courting. It's predator and prey, not a relationship between equals. This poem goes on much further than the Old Norse poem. Here, Gerður gives birth to a boy and attempts to escape. It ends on a more hopeful note, but it's also rather ominous as it hints at the wars to come in retribution for this abduction. There's a lot to say about this poem. I didn't really want to spoil everything here because I really think that it's worth experiencing the simplistic beauty of the poem on your own. Bloodhoof rewrites an ancient myth in a really important way. It gives voice to a woman whose perspective we never got before. In the Old Norse poem, I think Gerður speaks, 8 stanzas out of the 42 that makes up Skírnismál. This reimagining is so important because, like the opening lines of Blóðhófnir suggest, this poem specifically, Skírnismál, and Norse mythology more generally are both really important cultural artifacts. I don't think it would be too controversial to suggest that the Codex Regius or Koningsbók manuscript that holds this text is the most important cultural artifact that Iceland possesses. And further, Norse mythology more general is perhaps one of the most important cultural capital, is one of the most prized cultural capital that Icelanders really have. Icelandic literature and even to some extent Icelandic identity can't really escape the importance of this medieval mythologies. Its stories remain so prominent. even in the names of modern-day Icelanders. Gerður Kristný seems to be demanding that we revise these cultural memories, as their social and political power is clear, as these stories are constantly being told and retold throughout the pre-modern and modern era, and often without a critical eye. The narrator Gerður's desire in the opening lines of the poem to ball up these memories and throw them away is only thwarted by the fact that these memories are intangible. They're constructed, they're ephemeral. Rather than throw away these myths, Blóðhófnir demands that we reread Skírnismál and other Old Norse poems and find the voices that were silenced and give them voice. Thanks for watching.